asking me, how do I approach teaching some of these complexities of Israel's culture and society and political situation that we've been learning about to non-adult students, to teenagers? This material is probably going to be above the heads of students who are younger than middle school, but I think that some of this material could be parsed down into a way that younger students could understand it. But well beyond the specific videos that I have chosen, there's a technique here, and as a cultural historian, this is my field and my research more broadly, but it is using cultural output as a means of A, communicating the complexities of Israel, but B, using some of the universal nature of culture to allow our students to place these concepts into their own lives. I wanted to present pop icons, and knowing that I was going to teach about the complexities of Israeli culture and society through Israeli pop music, I wanted to help the kids start to think about American pop culture. So I felt aged when I asked my wife to help me identify some artists that teenagers would in all likelihood recognize. And I don't know if any of you who are participating in the session have any thoughts, but what comes to mind when we see this slide? What do we think of when we're looking at this variety of stars in American pop culture and American popular music? Yep, Halsey, Billie Eilish, Kendrick Lamar, Taylor Swift, impressive. Love it. Yes, definitely a diverse group of people. Young, yeah, I wanted to make sure that I selected artists that my participants in the teen group would relate to. Politicians are important, and political history is obviously quite important. But when we're dealing with our students, they oftentimes have different ways of relating to political issues. And at least in my experience working with teens, a lot of them get their information about what's going on in the world through social media. And in their social media feeds, it tends to be the case that they follow a lot of celebrities. And so in my attempt here to model some pedagogy that I've found to be effective, when I presented this slide, students started talking to me about the political causes that Halsey is involved in with women's rights issues and certain issues relating to the environment. And Taylor Swift has taken many causes that relate to women in the music industry and how it's often the case that women are paid less in the American music industry than men are. And she has even stepped away from some engagements as a result of what she felt was unfair treatment towards women. Killer Mike has been very active in Black Lives Matter. He is an Atlanta resident and is regularly on TV talking about what is happening in the Black community. Kendrick Lamar similarly deals with many issues in the Black community and social activism more broadly. Beyonce and her sister Solange are very involved in social causes. Billie Eilish has been very outspoken about a number of issues relating to body positivity and current social movements. And what this slide did was help the students understand, A, that pop stars represent certain segments of society, and part of their ability to be pop stars is appealing to the interests of different markets in America. And part of it is also understanding what culture represents. And it's a lot easier for me in dealing with college students or older students like adults to be able to assign the introduction to a great work of cultural history, explaining the field of cultural history and how we can use cultural output to get a bottom-up understanding of what society is like at different places. But in working with younger students, I have found that using examples of things, in this case, celebrities, that they can personally relate to is extremely helpful. And then when we move to a slide like this one, understanding that Israel has different segments of society, and that when we look at the top left picture, we see that In the Israeli military, there is a very wide representation of different segments of Israeli society, different ethnicities, Jews and non-Jews, women and men, Ethiopian Jews, Mizrahi Sephardic Jews, Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews, secular Ashkenazi Jews. We see many different segments of Israeli society. And within Yemenite culture, like we have in the bottom left, in the ultra-Orthodox community, in the Arab Israeli community, in urban areas versus rural areas, we have different pop trends that, when looked at properly and framed properly by an educator, can show students a lot about Israel and can help them relate to these different ideas and these different concepts that, without being able to connect them to things that are familiar in their own lives, may be more abstract than concrete. So moving from these two photos, setting up that in America, we have different figures who represent different aspects of society. And in Israel, we similarly have very different aspects of Israeli society. It is not monolithic or monocultural. Then we want to take a look at what exactly we mean by multiculturalism in Israel. And so I just provide some basic demography. And honestly, I think that this demography is important for all of us to remember. But when we're looking at Israel, we're looking at a country that is 74% Jewish, about 6.7 million. Of these 6.7 million, about half are Ashkenazi and about half are of Middle Eastern or African descent, mostly Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews, but within that we have 150,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel. We also have about 10% of Israel's Jewish population that are ultra-Orthodox and have a very different understanding of what Israel is and, more importantly, what it means to be Israeli. For many in the ultra-Orthodox community, they don't see national service in the military as being part of their Israeliness. They don't see the secular nationalism that many Israelis hold very dear to them as being a part of their Israeliness. Likewise, within this greater population of Jews in Israel, about 15% are from the former Soviet Union and came after 1990. And roughly 4% are from the Americas, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, again, reminding us that the majority of Jews are either in Israel or the United States, and specifically in America, American Zionism has never been a Zionism of Aliyah. And because it is such a small population of Jews in Israel who actually come from the United States, this in and of itself can be an entry point into talking about why is it that American Zionism does not involve moving to Israel. It's an important point. Of this segment of Israel, we have 21%, 1.9 million, that are Arab citizens. And it's very important to remind our students of those complexities that when we refer to Israel and we're talking about the citizens of the state of Israel, we likewise have to acknowledge that 21%, 1.9 million of that 9 million person population are not Jewish and in fact are Arab, some of whom identify with the Palestinian National Movement. And then we have 5% that are non-Jewish citizens of Israel. Most of these individuals came from the former Soviet Union and have been deemed as not being Jewish by the rabbinic authorities in Israel. But it's also the case that in Israel, as a citizen, you can marry someone from abroad who is not Jewish and bring them back to Israel and be married, and they can be a citizen of Israel too. So moving into looking at more distinct segments of Israeli society and what we can really pull from in terms of understanding how popular culture can tell us a little bit more about not only a specific aspect of Israel's population, but how they fit into Israeli society. What are some of those tensions? Oh, let me just check. Some athletes go to Israel to play sports and stay. Yes, this is actually very true. When I was a graduate student in Tel Aviv, I had a friend who was a former Maccabi Tel Aviv basketball player, guy from Chicago, not Jewish at all. So We'll begin with looking at religious and secular society in Israel. And what are some of the diverging agendas and priorities, but what are some of those tensions and flashpoints, and how do they play out in pop culture? Now, we know that in Israel, the majority of young people, after turning 18, they join the army. Now, in the ultra-Orthodox segment of Israel, it's the case that there are individuals who go into the army. Even though the Tal Law was repealed in 2012, we still don't see the majority of ultra-Orthodox young men going into the military, although there are government efforts to increase that. So we know that this question of the military is a deep tension. And if a student was to Google ultra-Orthodox in Israel, most likely they would see something about a protest, some young Orthodox Israelis clashing with police over issues relating to any number of things, but most likely something being opened on Shabbat in Jerusalem or something relating to military service. Now, when we look at secular society and what their flashpoints are, and when secular Israeli society comes to the streets, so to speak, to protest, it's for very different things. It's not about mandatory military conscription. That is something that is just built into the national identity of secular society. It's not about things being open on Shabbat, because for most secular Israelis, they just accept that most things are closed on Shabbat, but if they live in Tel Aviv and want to go get something at Tiv Tam on a Saturday, they will do so. But we do see very serious protests come about in secular and Israeli society relating to the environment, relating to economic issues, relating to a whole host of things going on in Israeli society that are very impactful to the lives of most secular Israelis. And so we can see that there are very different things that motivate these groups, and there are very different things that these groups speak out about, especially when it comes to the point of a protest movement or having a pop icon represent something that is significant to that community. So the first clip I have chosen comes from Kohav Nolad, which is a singing competition show in Israel, very similar to America's The Voice, literally translates to A Star is Born. And there was a particular episode where a contestant, who is actually the son of American Olim, who came from their accents, it sounds like New York, probably Brooklyn, to live in a settlement in the West Bank. And their son Yonatan is a singer who is interested in competing in this nationally televised reality TV show. And one of the hosts, who is secular, has a particular issue that he brings up with Jonathan that relates to this divide between secular and religious society in a very public form.
קוראים לי יונתן בלנק, אני גר באפרת. משפחה, אחוז 6 בנים. 6? 6 בנים.
ויש נחמיה תל זכריה ועסניה, סלים סעדיה מיכאל חנן חנניה, יחיה רוחה ורחמים.
בטח כל פעם שאתה שומע את זה אומרים לך, וואי, מסכנה אמא שלך.
נכון.
ברוך השם תאומים.
בינינו, איך זה לגדל 6 בנים?
סבבה, ממש.
כן? כן. לא מטריפים אותך כל הבית בוץ וזה, לא?
זה יותר שקט, אין הצעקות, צ'חות.
תראה, הם נראים ילדים נורא טובים.
משתדלים.
איך הוא שר?
הוא מוכשר משהו, פשוט לא כאימא. כולם אומרים את זה, אבל וואו. Come here, I want to fix your shirt because your thing is coming. Okay, they ask a lot of questions before when you get up there. So what's your plan?
I have no idea. Just answer the question.
You're gorgeous.
So are you.
You're amazing. Calm down,
יונתן בלנק. זה נאמר nice Jewish boy.
שלום יונתן.
שלום, מה נשמע?
מה שלומך?
בסדר גמור, ברוך השם.
מאיפה אתה מגיע אלינו?
באפרת, בגוש עציון.
אתה שר בחייך? אתה מתעסק במוזיקה? אתה כותב?
אני שר מדי פעם בהרכבים בישיבה.
תגיד, שאתם מופיעים בישיבה, אתם מופיעים מול בנות?
לא, אנחנו רק בישיבה בנים.
ואתם מופיעים גם רק מול בנים?
כן, יש מורות לפעמים, אבל...
אבל זה לא בעייתי מבחינתך להופיע למשל קהל מול הבנות?
לא מול בנות, עם בנות זה בעיה, אבל...
לא אוהב את זה, אני לא אוהב את הדבר הזה, זה הדרת נשים בעיניי. וחבל שככה אנחנו גדלים.
סליחה,
זה לא
מוקי,
קשור לאמונה.
זה אמונה של בן אדם.
ברגע שאתה פוסל מישהו
הוא
אחר
לא פוסל.
בגלל... אתה פוסל.
הוא לא פוסל.
אתה אומר, אל תעמדי לידי כי את אישה נקודה.
לא, תקשיב, בן אדם נולד למקום מסוים. הוא אומר לך, אני שר...
הנה את זה, אני לא מאשים אותו, אני אומר שחבל
זה אמונה שלו.
זה לא פייר, זה ממש לא פייר. תראה את הבן שלי.
בפריים טיים, ערוץ 2, אנחנו כל ישראל...
תסתמו את הפה שלכם.
אחד לשני, אני לא אוהב את זה.
הוא לא אמר שום דבר אחר, תעצרו, לא, תעצרו. לא, זה מעצבן אותי. הראל, אחי, תקשיב רגע, תקשיבו
אפשר
טוב.
לשמוע את השיר שלו?
רגע, שנייה, מה את אומרת?
אפשר להקשיב לשיר שלו? על מה מדברים? רוצים לשמוע את השיר שלו. הדיון זה לא קשור לשיר שלו.
שיהיה בהצלחה עם אותה.
רגע, לא, יש הדרת נשים בשולחן הזה, ספציפית.
חס וחלילה.
אתה שומע זמרות?
כן,
זה הכל.
שנייה,
איזה זמרת שאתה הכי אוהב?
קרן פלס.
זה הכל, לך תשיר.
זה אמונה, חיים שלי, זה אמונה. זה קבלת האחר, אח שלי.
זה מכבסת מילים.
זה לא מכבסת מילים.
זה מכבסת מילים. אין קבלת האחר כשאתה לא מקבל את האחר. אין דבר כזה.
פעם אליה, לא לשיר עם אישה.
אני לא בא אליו בטענות, אני לא בא אליו בהאשמה, אפילו אחת. אני אומר, המקום שבו הוא נמצא עושה את הדבר הזה. זה חשוב לי מאוד להגיד את זה מול כולם פה, ומול אנשים בבית.
חבר'ה, יש פה ילד שרוצה לשיר.
חבר'ה, שנים של מסורת, מה, קצת?
כל הכבוד. הבן שלי רוצה לשיר, אולי תדברו פוליטיקה, אני אחר כך.
את צודקת.
אני צודקת, אז תפסיקו.
את צודקת.
תביאי לו לשיר.
יונתן, אתה שומע אותנו?
אמא, זה כמו לביאה, היא קופצת להגן על הבן
זאת
שלה, זה
אימא.
מדהים.
זאת אימא.
יונתן,
כן.
אנחנו מקשיבים רק לך ורק לאיך שאתה שר. כל הוויכוח שהיה פה לא קשור בשום צורה בעצם לשיפוט שלנו.
ויואו, איך אתה דומה
שיהיה בהצלחה.
לאסי עזר, יא אללה.
רק יותר יפה.
זהו, עכשיו גמרת אותו לגמרי.
מה זה גמרה אותו לגמרי?
So I'm going to stop this here. Not only does this just show how different Israel is and that this sort of belligerency would erupt on live television and the mother of the contestant would jump up on stage and scream at some of the most important icons in Israeli popular music today, but we also see that these tensions between Orthodox and secular life are more than just protests in the streets between policemen and angry yeshiva students. This hits at the core of Israeliness, where we have multiple relationships with what it means to be Jewish. If you were to ask Mookie, the rapper who was up there complaining about Yonatan's yeshiva, he would talk about all these different things about Judaism that would have nothing, well, I shouldn't say nothing, but mostly nothing to do with Yonatan's understanding of Judaism, but they are both Israelis. They are both Jews. They are both Jewish Israelis. And at the end of the day, they are part of the greater mess that is Israel. But again, in trying to just explain to a student that there is a divide between secular society and religious society in Israel, and that it's more than just the issue of the army, it really is a lot more complex. Sometimes watching something like a reality TV show and seeing it unfold in a way that is both entertaining and relatable can start conversations about what are the priorities of religious society in Israel versus secular society in Israel? What are some of the differences? What is it that would motivate Jews from the Orthodox community to get fired up? And what is it that motivates those from secular Jewish society to get fired up, so to speak. And so this is an entry point into many conversations about issues in Israel. But again, this is just something I found. YouTube and Google are your best friends. I encourage all of you, well beyond just using the slides that I'm going to give you access to, go out and search for things. Find topics that you find interesting, that you want to talk to your students about, and almost guaranteed, if you look for long enough, you'll be able to find a video clip with English subtitles. Now, staying within this realm of secular and Orthodox Jewish society, I chose a video by the Israeli hip-hop group Hadag Nahash called Yom Shishi. Now, Hadag Nahash is, I would say, a pretty standard, extremely popular left-of-center pop hip-hop group in Israel. They're very known for being outspoken activists. And on the right, I have a photograph here of the band performing at a rally for placing stronger regulations on Israel's emerging natural gas industry that has come about in the last decade. So we can see that they fit into what you would consider pretty typical left-wing Tel Aviv society. They participate in protests promoting stronger environmental regulations, and they are extremely popular across Israel, but they wrote a song about what Yom Shishi, what Friday afternoon, what the beginning of Shabbat means to them. And I found it on YouTube with subtitles, and here we have Hadag Nahash's video, Yom Shishi.
יום שישי הגיע, והוא בא בדיוק בזמן, כמה שחיכיתי כבר בעצם למה שהוא מרגיע, ואם הוא פה אז זה סימן שהלך עוד שבוע בשקט.
שוב שישי תפס אותי עם הלשון בחוץ, אחרי עוד שבוע שלחץ אותי לרוץ, עוצר את הכל סטופ, וזה בא לי מה זה טוב עכשיו, לא 3 בצהריים, כבר נפתח לי הרעב, נכנסים לאוטו ויאללה בוא ניסע, עולים לירושלים לראות את המשפחה.
שבת שלום, הגענו, שיחות סלון, שיחות חולים, לכל המומחים בכל התחומים, עיתונים יש תבשילים,
כמה אוכל,
יא אלוהים.
אבא אומר מתי תקנה דירה, אמא אומרת עכשיו זה הזמן, ככה זה אצלנו הכל על השולחן, כן, גם כל האוכל, גם כל הבלגן,
קומפות ופיצוחים, לספה מפוצצים, בחדשות שוב מטריעים, עלייה במחירים, תמיד בתוך מסגרת ראש, הכל לחוק, הכל יגלוש, ורק המשפחה מסדרת לי את הראש. יום שישי הגיע, והוא בא בדיוק בזמן, כמה שחיכיתי כבר בעצם למה שהוא מרגיע, ואם הוא פה אז זה סימן שהלך עוד שבוע בשקט. יום שישי הגיע, והוא בא בדיוק בזמן, כמה שחיכיתי כבר בעצם למה שהוא מרגיע, ואם הוא פה אז זה סימן שהלך עוד שבוע בשקט.
2:32, שישי בצהריים, שיא הקרחה המחנה יהודה ירושלים, המחיר מתחיל לצנוח, צריך למכור את הסחורה,
עוד מעט ירד עלינו שבת המלכה,
הנה הדור זכתר מגן התות, בדיוק נועל את החנות, המפתחות מכניס לכיס, אז יום ראשון בבוקר יישאר סגור התריס, ישאיר בחוץ את כל המחשבות על תכלס, אופס נקרא לי החוט ומה לאט לאט מתפשט אצלי חיוך שכל העיר ולכל הארץ מורידים הילוך, טוב לי כל השבוע אבל זה טוב חלקי, ואז יום שישי מגיע אבל טוב חלקי.
יום שישי הגיע, והוא בא בדיוק בזמן, כמה שחיכיתי כבר בעצם למה שהוא מרגיע, ואם הוא פה אז זה סימן שהלך עוד שבוע בשקט.
So I'll stop this here at the guitar solo so we can have time to dig into the rest of our videos because we still have more to watch. But there are a few things that I think are really important here, and then I'm interested to hear what you all think. But for me, what this video can do, especially juxtaposed with the other one, is show that Hadag Nahash is very Jewish. First of all, they are talking about how on Friday afternoon they drive to Jerusalem to go have Shabbat dinner with their family, where we even see imagery in the video of eating challah, lighting candles, wine being placed on the table. And so it's not that secular Israeli society isn't Jewish, it's just they're Jewish in a different way than ultra-Orthodox society. And Jerusalem, the Shuk, it's a place that is going to close on Friday afternoon because of Shabbat, and they need to get there in time to buy whatever it is that their mom asked them to buy to bring to dinner. But we see some of these nuances unfold in the different types of Judaism that exist within Jewish society in Israel. And it doesn't mean that one group is more Jewish than the other. It just means that Judaism in Israel is very pluralistic. And for those who think that there isn't pluralism in Judaism in Israeli society, they are wrong. And by the way, there's plenty of conservative Judaism. It's significantly smaller, but there's about 50 synagogues for each denomination in Israel right now, and they're not recognized by the rabbinate. And again, it's not that the quote-unquote secular Israelis in Hadag Nahash are even secular or not Jewish. It's just a different type of Jewish identity. They celebrate Shabbat. They have everything closed down around them. They go have Shabbat dinner with their family. And again, it creates a sense of relatability that helps students understand. And that is part of that ingrown Jewishness within Jewish Israeli society, that no matter if you are Yonatan's family living in a settlement in the West Bank, or you are a member of Hadag Nahash driving from Tel Aviv to have dinner with your mom and get beaten up about not having bought a condo in Tel Aviv because of the economy, there is something consistent across Jewish Israeli life, no matter what those tensions may be. And so moving on to some other issues that can be taught through music in a very accessible way, as I see it. Ethiopian life in Israel. Now, in just explaining in a basic sense, in the 1980s and 90s, there were tens of thousands of Jews in Ethiopia that were living under persecution and wanted to come to the state of Israel. The state of Israel worked with various military, intelligence, and humanitarian agencies to put together Operation Solomon in 1991 and others to literally bring these tens of thousands of Jews in Ethiopia to Israel. And then, like other immigrant groups, they arrived. Now, like other immigrant groups in Israel, they've had troubles integrating into Israeli society. And it is not unique to Israel that there are these problems with different immigrant groups integrating into society. And it is not unique to the Ethiopian community in Israel to have these issues integrating into Israeli society. The exact same process occurred in the 1950s and 60s as Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews came to Israel. And those Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews who came to Israel, who felt like they were not getting a fair shake in society, looked to the American Civil Rights Movement as an understanding of how to create a framework for a civil rights movement in Israel to elevate their place in society. So we see a very similar circumstance occurring with today's Ethiopian population in Israel, where we see certain Ethiopians identifying with the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was an instance in recent history where a young Ethiopian man was shot and killed by Israeli police. And there were a series of protests where many young Ethiopian Israelis, Ashkenazi Israelis, Tel Avivim writ large, and many other from around the country got together and protested. Now, this is something that is probably quite familiar to your students in following the news and the events in the world, but it's not a bad thing to engage in the complexity of Israeli society or to acknowledge that within Israeli society there are racial tensions. In any country in the world you go to, there are going to be issues surrounding race and power and protests and social mobilization. And it is okay to talk about that and to do so honestly, to let your students know as well that Israel is a real place and that when they get to college and learn more complexities about Israeli society, they're not going to be surprised and there's not going to be this gut reaction of, you lied to me or you didn't tell me the full picture. You can be honest with them and tell them that it's okay and that they can dig into that nuance. And so one of the ways that I have done that is through Ethiopian hip hop. And there is an Ethiopian Israeli hip hop band called Cafe Shahor Chazak, which means strong black coffee, an illustrative name in and of itself. But they wrote a song called Yehiyeh Beseder. This is a song that is very different from David Broza's song of the same title. This is a very different generation of Israeli writing a song of the same title, but this is members of that Ethiopian community who, by the way, are very politically active. And here we have a photograph of these individuals from the band meeting with the former US ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, at the American Embassy in Israel. The Ethiopian community in Israel has looked to hip hop music as a means of expressing its frustrations with Israeli society and a means of empowering itself. Oh, Yehiyeh Tov, you are absolutely correct. My apologies. But regardless, we have David Broza with Yehiyeh Tov, Cafe Shahor Chazak with Yehiyeh Beseder, essentially saying everything is going to be okay, but we need to express some of these issues that we see in Israel, and we're going to do so in Hebrew, and we're going to do so through music. And so here is the video of Cafe Shahor Chazak's song, Yehiyeh Beseder.
שחור חזק אני יודע שהכל יהיה בסדר לא משנה מה כולם מדברים בסדר ניתן בראש בעזרת השם מנדר אני יודע שהכל יהיה סבבה ניתן את הלב והנשמה בסדר, לא מקשיב למי שמדבר בלי קשר חושב מחוץ אל הקופסה וגם מעבר אמת מקי יורק עד הקבר לא מתערבב, לא משחק במשחקים לא קונה אלף חיוכים עסוק בעצמי, לא תובע בתככים שנחשים שמנסים למשוך בחוטים בבילן בזיין עכבר מול עין בחיפוש אחר האושר לא מחפש להיות המעליין בום שקלק קפה שחור חזק עם הנצ'ח
So I'm going to pause this here. I really like this song, but I want to make sure that we have time to get through everything. But again, we see popular culture coming out in Israel that can very much explain a lot of what is happening. And by the way, do so in Hebrew. To be able to learn about these aspects of Israeli society from Israeli pop stars in modern Hebrew is a great way to allow your students to engage with Israel for what it actually is without having to color it. You can let those in Israel who may even be frustrated explain things. I think just the title of the song, Everything's Gonna Be Okay, this is a signal and a song that came out at a time when tensions were very high in Israel within the Ethiopian community. And these guys, who are some of the more popular Ethiopian Israeli singers, wanted to send a message of hope, not just to Israel, but I think to the world more broadly. So moving along, another Ethiopian pop singer is a young woman named Aviva Dessay. Now, she is not in the hip hop world. She actually studied at Israel's School of Jazz, but she has decided that she wants to write music that is in the language that she grew up speaking at home with her parents, Amharic, which is the language that most Jews in Ethiopia spoke before coming to Israel. And so I have a video here of Aviva Dessay performing a song in Amharic at the Sigd Festival in Tel Aviv. Now, Sigd is a holiday that was celebrated in the Ethiopian Jewish community, praying for one day returning to Zion. Now, it's the case that almost all of the Jews in Ethiopia, there still are some remaining, and that's a whole other tension with the Israeli government that I'm not going to get into. But considering that the majority of the Jews from Ethiopia are already in Zion, the need for a Sigd festival is different, and it has become a celebration of Ethiopian Israeli culture and life. And so here is a video of Aviva Dessay, Ethiopian Israeli performer, singing a song in Amharic at the Tel Aviv festival celebrating Ethiopian life in Israel.
በኢትዮጵያ ትንሣኤ ዘመን ነው ዕለቱ ስትሰሙ በረከት ወደ ምስራቅ ባልንጀሮችን ቁሙ በተራ እንችን ሰብሬ በትስክ ስራ እንኳን በትና ያለኝ ማት በደጃራለው ኮከብ ስቦት ሆበር ማስንቆ ሆበር ግራር ስፈላገሬ ሆበር ዋሽንቴ አንተ ማስንቆ ስታይ ሶዳኮ እንኳን አደረሰ ለአዲስ ዘመን ዘመን ሸፈኖ ይታደስ
So I'm going to stop that there so we can continue to see some more diverse music. But again, it's important to let students know as well that Israeli music is not just one thing. Israeli music can be African music. Israeli music can be Yemenite style music. So in getting to Yemenite and Mizrahi and Sephardic culture, we see a huge movement amongst third and fourth generation Mizrahi and Sephardic singers to, much like Aviva Dessay did in wanting to sing the songs that she learned and the languages she learned growing up with her parents, many young Mizrahi and Sephardic singers want to perform music in Judeo-Arabic. And I included a photograph of the young women of Ewa, three sisters actually, of the family Chaim, very different from the American Three Sisters who are the Chaim band, although both Israelis. But Ewa has taken traditional Yemenite Judeo-Arabic songs and worked with a hip-hop producer to create multiple albums of extremely fun music that takes traditional Yemenite Jewish Arabic and modernizes it. And interestingly, their songs have become very popular across the world, but even in Yemen. And so this is also a case well beyond just representing an aspect of Israeli society where we see Jews in Israel using their music to connect to a greater community of Yemenites. Has wonderful music. I've used a bunch of their songs. Go on their YouTube page. There are so many different sounds and musical aesthetics that are fun, that are accessible, and can more importantly create a more whole picture of what Israel is, that it is not just the imagery that we get from a birthright trip or a high school trip to Israel or the conflict. It is a rich culture that represents the entirety of world Jewry, and part of that is Yemenite culture. So I had a video including of Neda El-Kayam performing North African music, but I want to jump to my last video here to show that hip-hop likewise is used in the Arab sector in Israel to talk about problems in Israeli society. And in this most recent electoral process, the first election in April of 2019, there was a wide movement amongst those Arab citizens of Israel to in fact boycott the vote. And there was a sense amongst many individuals in this community of roughly 1.9 million that they didn't trust their leaders, they didn't trust Netanyahu, and why not just stay out of the process? And one of Israel's most influential rappers from the Arab Israeli community is a guy named Tamer Nafar. And he released a video before the April election that was an attempt to not only encourage that 21% of Israeli society to vote and to use their democratic voice, but to likewise communicate to his fans and really to Arab Israeli society more broadly that it's complicated. He understands why they would want to boycott, but at the end of the day, even understanding that internal debate, that he thinks participating in democracy is the best answer. And so here's Tamer Nafar's video, Tamer on Tamer, or Tamer versus Tamer, expressing his own internal dialogue with relationship to this notion of should we boycott or should we vote.
سيداتي سادتي, ladies and gentlemen, معنا هون اليوم تامر ضد تامر. فيش ربحان وفيش خسران. التنين في نفس الحلبة في نفس الطريق مع بعض ماشيين. خلونا نبدأ.
الفاشي ماشي كل شي ماشي كل شي ماشي معاه. هيك المنطق هيك الدنيا، الارض ارضنا، دولة دولتهم، فالكنيست مش إلنا والشكل مش إلنا. شو رايك بهاد نحذف مصارينا ونوقع لهم اقتصاد؟ ضرايب رايحة وجاي عالجيش، نبلش نزرع شاي بالبيت، هيك بنمول الصواريخ عغزة لما نقعد كوفي شوب نحكي بالمقاطعة وقدامنا باي ولاتيه. ميبي بيستغلوني تيبينوا ليبرالية شوفوا غيري يا بيبي الديمقراطية السو 80s احنا في زمن ترامب والفاشية لغة المينستريم هاها فصوتي ما بيكفي الأغلبية عنصرية خسرنا فتركني ليه أدخل حرب صواريخ وبإيدنا سكين ليه أدخل حرب دبابات وبإيدنا حجر هيك احنا مبنيين صمدين بقولش رح نحرر فلسطين بس إذا صوتنا ممكن يهدف ليبرمان يسجن بيبي فاحنا جاهزين الفاشي ماشي كل شي ماشي كل شي ماشي معاه يا بتصوت يا بتصفي خارج هاي البلاد ما فيش ديوتي ما فيش ديوتي فري بهالمكان ما فيش جوني ايامنا سودا ايامنا بلاك هالعالج فقر هالوسعوا قطر بس بالانتخابات ببينوا بالافق ليش اخسر يوم شغل تخبت المره اللي فاتت وفرطت بالنسبه الي هاي السفينه غرقت ايه بالمرة لا انت شاهدت التايتانيك احنا شاهدنا المرمرة كل أزمة بوقفوا تيمثلوا همي وهمك بعدين الفقر مش صنع اخوانك صنع اولاد عمك لما ميري حاولت تنزلني من المنصة وقفوا معي ما شفتش ما كنتش معنا نفس خلينا نبلش من الالف اعمل معروف حط الكسل عالجنب حط عدم الامل عجنب حط الببجي والهبل عجنب خلينا نمشي مرة واحدة مع بعض الشعارات بتتهمش جنب كلمة مع بعض باللحظة هاي في تهديد علينا وعولادنا شو قرارنا عرب شمانت والشمانة حمضت وفات اوانها تستهترش بفشيتهم شوف شو عملوا بجدادنا فقول لبنت قول لشكاد مش حنخلع لفيجلم مش حنخلع لسموتريتش مش حنخلع لسلالة كهانة مش حنخلع كن بدي اقاطع وقررت انه بديش انقطع فمن اجل اخواني بال67 بتصوت للي في مسيرة العودة ماشيين بالتصوت مش منطقي اتنازل عن هذه الاداة لما ما عناش كتير ادوات غير فبالتصوت من اجل كل لاجئ ولاجئ بدي اصوت من اجل معنفات بالملاجئ بدي.
So we're running out of time and I'm going to stop the video here. Tamar Nafar is definitely a figure who is controversial, can be very problematic, but again, in teaching Israel for what it is, I don't think that you are doing a disservice to your students to show there is an Arab sector of Israeli society. Many are bitter. Many don't agree with the direction of Israel. But at the end of the day, this percentage of the population is in Israel. And they do participate in the democratic process. In this particular case, they were about to not participate. And I don't know how much Tamar Nafar's video motivated people, but there were a smaller number than normal, but a fair amount that came out to vote. But in the two elections following April, there were many in that segment that voted and actually put together some of the largest Arab coalitions in the Knesset. So it's important to be able to, again, paint complexity where you're not necessarily taking a side. And you don't have to say you agree with Tamar Nafar, but I do think that we would do a disservice to our students by not presenting the full picture and the complexity that is Israeli society and what it means to be a democracy with a 21% minority population that is Arab and may not have the same association with Israel as Jewish society, certainly doesn't feel the same way on Friday evening that Hadag Nahash would feel or Yonatan Blanc's family would feel. And again, without having to endorse, you can present. And that is one of the beauties of using cultural sources is you can throw it out there and talk about it. I think it's very important to talk about Israel in the context of the Middle East. And you can reference polling because most of the Arab segment, when polled and asked if there was an independent Palestinian state, would you rather be under the PA or under Israel? Basically, everyone says, I'd rather remain Israeli. And there are very clear reasons why that is the case. And so again, paint the complexity. Let them know that this is all a gray space of confusion, but they should at least know what those islands are within the big gray spaces that there are between them. I would have to do some digging to find specific polls, but the Palestinian Research Center is one of the best in terms of capturing polling, and just Google it. They have plenty of studies.
Do more Israelis pick up some Amharic or Arabic or Russian or anything because there are all these different languages that are being performed in popular music?
First of all, most Israelis are just learning English first and foremost. And I can even tell you in a professional capacity, being a PhD student at an Israeli university, especially after looking at that debate in 1912 over what the Technion would be in, for young Israeli academics, they have to do something in English if they want a career. And it's the case that for musicians, for scholars, for tech workers, for anyone, well, not anyone, but for most people who want to have a serious career, having English as a second language is extremely important in being competitive in the Israeli marketplace, or if you want to take your skills elsewhere. We also see, as a result of travel, a lot of Israelis learning Spanish, a lot of Israelis learning Arabic. It's the case that most of them are doing so through programs that are geared towards particular types of army service, but Israel is a very multilingual country, and music and pop culture certainly plays a role with that. I'm sure there are kids in America who, as a result of K-pop bands, are learning at least some terms in Korean, and I'm sure specifically if those students live in an area with a large Korean population, then they're probably learning even more. In Israel, similar to the US, there's certainly a rural and urban divide. But since there are really only a couple urban centers and it's just a small country without a lot of space in the rural periphery, that you don't have the same segmentation. But it's definitely the case that a right-wing Israeli living in Dimona is probably not going to go to a Mookie concert in Tel Aviv. The judge who was grilling Yonatan Blanc for going to yeshiva and not singing in front of women. Similarly, you're probably not going to find a young yeshiva student going to a Hadag Nachash concert, but you probably find a variety of Israelis that would go to an Aviva Dessay or a Cafe Shahor Chazak concert. But I think that the segmentation is certainly there, but it's easy to explain to students. It's just a smaller country. And so while the societal rifts are present, they are not as grandiose as they are in the United States.
I feel that Israeli music, it's so much more. It's not just the Yetov and David Broza. It's so much more. There is so many young, talented artists that are not necessarily singing politics. They just sing fun songs.
I chose not to show David Broza for a reason. I actually know David Broza and his family quite well. And he's great, but he hasn't been relevant for 30 years. I tried to showcase some new young talent. Don't feel like you have to be heavy with music. You can certainly use music just to have a good time and let students hear some nice sound.